My name is Jason Howlin, and I'm an iOS developer at Oath. And it used to be called AOL, and then we got purchased by Verizon, and then Verizon purchased Yahoo, and we did a little bit of refactoring and came out with Oath. And it's really a family of all the brands that make up AOL and Yahoo. So you have TechCrunch, Engadget, Huffington Post, AOL, Yahoo News, Sports, Finance, all of those things. And it's great as an engineer because now we get to work with all the Yahoo folks and learn from them. So what I'd like to talk about today is building reusable and flexible code for modern iOS development. We're going to talk about frameworks. We're also going to talk about extensions. Then I'm going to go over with you some tips and things that we've learned along the way. So if you look at the current universe now, for the Apple universe and the landscape, it's a lot different than it was just 4 years ago or so. I mean, there are more platforms now, more devices, different device sizes. The hardware rivals what you'll find on the desktop. I mean, I was working with Keynote here for this presentation, and it's just about the same on the iPad and phone as it is on the desktop. So that means as developers, mobile developers, we're developing software that's as complex as desktop software. People expect the same features. And there are more extension points now with iOS, so there's more ways in which your code may run. I'll talk a bit about that later. So what's our goal? I mean, we want to write code that's reusable. We can change it easily. When product comes to you and says, we want to incorporate this new feature, you want to be able to have some work that you've already done that you can apply to this. And you don't want to have to reinvent the wheel. And one of the things that we all do, I think, as developers is we kind of box ourselves in because we didn't think about the right way to do it from the beginning. So hopefully you'll pick up some tips here. We want to get features out the door, and we want fewer bugs. I'm not sure we'll have fewer bugs, but with frameworks, we'll have fewer places maybe to fix those bugs. So what are frameworks? Well, I'd say that they sound a little scarier maybe than they are. It's really just a convenient way to package up and reuse your code and resources. And that's it. What goes into them? Well, of course, your code, but you can also put other things in them, like nibs and storyboard files, asset catalogs, header files, documentation, localized strings. I mean, they're really just a directory that's on disk that has a very specific structure. When you create a framework, you get a unique bundle ID so that you can reference it and the assets inside of it. So where in your iOS app, you might say, give me an image from the main bundle. You wouldn't do that with the framework. You would say bundle with this identifier, and you would give it your bundle ID. They have some benefits in that they are loaded once into memory. They're shared across applications. They're also shared across your extensions, so it really helps when you're putting together your application. You don't have to compile and bundle the code in with each extension. If you create a framework for your reusable code, it only has to include it once in each extension, and your application just linked to it. And why do you do it? So really, you want to organize your code, but most importantly, you want to promote encapsulation and division of responsibilities. So you want to make it very clear. You're developing an API when you build a framework, and you want to keep it very focused and organized well. And it reduces dependencies. And what I mean by that is, so let's say you have a project and you have a view controller in here, and it just about does what you want for another project. So you move it out into your application, and you go to build it, and suddenly you start getting errors. Well, this view controller references, say, a table view cell, and that references a checkmark view. And it uses some date formatters that you have in the application. And those may use an extension on NSLocale. And somebody else is going into the settings manager and the colors constants. And if you've ever tried this and you bring it over, I mean, it's just Xcode just turns red and kind of a small hole rips in the universe. When you build yourself a framework, you force yourself to stay vigilant, and the code that you bring into it has to run within the confines of the framework. And if you were to bring that framework into another project, everything would be there the way that you need it. If you look at what Apple does with their frameworks, they generally follow this pattern where you have, for instance, EventKit, which is the framework for working with reminders and calendars. They have an event kit, and inside of there you have the model objects that you work with, so EK Event Store, EK Event, Calendar, Alarm. And then they'll usually supply also a UI framework for that, so an EventKit UI. And that's where you might have your view controllers to create and edit an event, save it to the store. So very separate, but very reusable. I do the same thing with contacts. You have the database for Contact Store. You have ways to go in and query the database and get your contact objects out. And they provide a contact picker and also a contact edit view controller. So what goes into it? Well, you'll put your data model. So all the objects that make up the data in your application, the database itself, any sort of stack that you need to get the database up and running. You'll want to put your business logic in there. You also will want to put some utility and helper code. And if you have enough of that, you may find that if that code is reusable, everybody has the extensions that they bring into every project and use over and over again. So it might be helpful to create like a utility framework or a bunch of utility frameworks. And then specific to your application, you would want to include some reusable UI code, kind of like in the contacts and EventKit frameworks. So at AOL Oath, we're big into mail. We built a framework here called MailKit, and it allows us to include email inside of applications. And when we built it, we wanted to incorporate, we use core data for all of our objects and persistence to disk. We also included all of our networking code in there and all of our logic. And as we developed the framework, we built a sample application along with it. And that's what you see there. It kind of looks like it's nothing fancy, but it actually does everything a mail client does. And that does something really important for you as you're working. It forces you to put yourself into the shoes of the developer, the consumer of your framework, and say, okay, what would it be like to use this in the simplest way possible? What would just be nice to use from within the application? And it also forces you to look for places where in your sample application, you're adding a lot of code that really could belong in the framework. So we built this, and then we included it into the AOL app that has a native email experience. And we also included it into our Alto, which is our next generation email app. It supports more than just email accounts from AOL. It has all the fancy features that are common in email clients these days. And so that works well for us. And just to give you a quick example of how easy it is to create a framework, I'm just going to show you what's involved. So Xcode makes this really easy. All you do is go to add a new target. And down at the bottom, there's an option for a CocoaTouch framework. And you'd give it a name. I'm going to bring in a utility file here that I use when developing. It just generates random strings and numbers for you. It's helpful when you're laying things out. And it creates a new target for you. I called it arbitrary. Let's look at what it gave us on disk. It just created a directory, and it only put two things in there. It has a plist and a header file. And if you want to add files to it, you can just drag them in. And then inside of the framework, you want to tell it to include that file. So you'll just add files, select it. And then inside of your application, you would import it like you do any of the other frameworks. And to use it, it's a category on string or a class function, and it gives you your make that a little bit bigger, and it gives it. So that's it. I mean, that's all you need to do. It's easy to import. It's easy to include in multiple projects, and that was the first demo. All right, so the second one is called iTunes Search, and I wanted to put something together to kind of demonstrate all of this, and I chose something that was really simple, but I think the principles apply to much larger projects, and it's really the same things that we follow at work that work well. But we put together a sample application, and it just searches iTunes. It gets tracks back and displays them in a collection. And it's super simple. And I'll show you how the game plan was to develop this, and I put naive here. So this is kind of like open Xcode, create a new project, and get going. And we want to use core data as our model and persistence option. So when we create a new project, in the app delegate, it builds us a really nice core data stack and gives us a context to work in. And in our list view controller, we're going to create a collection view. And when we search for a term, we'll go out to the iTunes API and make a call. We'll come back and get the JSON and parse it. We'll save a track to the database. We'll download the artwork for that particular one. It's a separate network call. We'll save the artwork back to core data. Oops. And then we'll, oh boy, I got to go through this again. And then we'll observe the track. So as the tracks are coming in and they're changing, we have an observer attached to the manage object context, and we're updating. So, you know, it's a little bit of code in our view controller here, but let's go ahead and just see, and see if it even works. So we'll bring it up here, and I can search for. And it's awesome. We actually also added a feature in where if you tap on it, it'll mark it as a favorite. We'll use that later. So, hooray! I mean, we built it. We have something that's bothering us a little bit because, you know, we didn't think too much about it. We just built it. The code is not pretty. I mean, just to show you, this is kind of what it looks like. This is in our view controller, and on search, we go out and create a data task to go out and get the data. We parse it. Then we create a new object to insert into our database. Then we create another request to go out and get the artwork. We save that to the database, and then we reload our data. So, but we don't have a lot of time. And there's this wisdom. I love this. And we say, OK, well, you know what? We want to get things out the door, and so we ship it. And it's a smashing success. Goes to the top of the iTunes charts, and they feature you on Planet of the Apps, and you know, all of these things. And then your product designer and your partners and your investors come back and they say, OK, look, you know, we want to do iTunes Search 2.0. You say, OK, well, that sounds interesting. And so they come and they say, it's the same, but it's going to have a today extension. And you say, OK, all right, it looks good. I haven't really used them yet, but you do some research into extensions. And you open up Xcode, and you do new target, and you get this. And you're like, I don't even know what half of these things are. Like, you know, what is this? But, you know, it's clear that this is the direction Apple is going in. I mean, you know, making your app more a part of the ecosystem and more a part of other apps and their own apps is the direction they're going. So it's why it's all the more important that you kind of take this approach when developing your code so that you can take advantage of these new things. You know, you don't want to be in a position And we've been there, where you go to WWDC and they come out with some awesome new features, and your product people say, oh, we got to have this on release day for iOS 10 or what have you. And then you go in to look at your code and try to implement some of this stuff, and it just is a real problem getting it to your code to work outside of your application. So as a developer, you go and you say, okay, I'll start working on this. I created a new Today extension, and it's kind of the moment of truth, because what do? You could refactor, which is good. It'll make your life easier. You never liked all that code in the view controller, or you could do that. But unfortunately, that won out. So let's see what happened here. So in this case, you copy the code that you had, and you bring it into your Today view controller that Xcode gave you, and you start to get problems, right? These are these dependencies I was telling you about. So now you have to go and track down all of these files and these classes and make sure that, for instance, the third red line there is the app delegate. Well, the app delegate doesn't exist in the Today extension. It doesn't exist on the watch. It doesn't exist in the Siri intent. So, this is like why you want to be careful and draw your boundaries from the beginning. Now, yes, and frameworks and extensions were both introduced in iOS 8. So I think Apple was trying to tell us something when they did this. And it's to maintain your sanity while going forward, you better adopt frameworks if you want to take advantage of extensions. So being the good developer you are, you go back and you say, okay, you know what, I'm going to refactor. Good enough isn't. And so let's look at how we might approach this and what we might do. So you decide that you're going to build a framework called iTunes Kit. And inside of there, you want to provide one class that's kind of an interface for consumers of it. We'll call it the iTunes Manager. And we're going to create some other classes to help the iTunes Manager out. So we're going to create one whose job it is to go out and make requests to the iTunes API and get the results back. And the iTunes Manager is going to parse the JSON that it gets back. And we're going to create a separate object to represent our core data stack, because we don't want it in the app delegate. I don't know why Apple puts it in there for you in their project template. It's not a good place for it. And the iTunes Manager will be able to reach in and query and save tracks to the database. And then we'll have another class that just goes to get the artwork. It's actually a separate call. It doesn't go to the iTunes API. They give you a URL that you use to download. But this looks pretty good, and then we'll let the iTunes Manager also save that to the database. So I think that cleans things up a little bit. But we're going to hide a lot of this from the consumers of our application. And the only thing that we're going to make available to them are just these two functions. And one is called search for artist, and we'll give it a string. And it'll return to you an array of tracks or an error. And the other thing we're going to do is add a track observer. And that way, when these tracks change, when they're being updated in the database, you can give a function that'll just get called over and over as they're changing. So I think that cleans things up quite a bit. We also look at the Today extension and we say, it looks an awful lot like our list. Maybe we can reuse some of that. So we decide that we want to build iTunes Kit UI. And inside of there, we're going to create an iTunes list view controller, and it will have the collection view. Of course, we'll have the cell that we use, and we'll even include an asset catalog that has that star image that we looked at. Oh. All right, so for our Today extension, I think we have a game plan here. We're going to just import our iTunes list view controller, and we should be good. Now, there's no search bar here. Because we put the search bar up in the navigation bar, and there's no navigation bar on the view controller that's included in the Today extension, that's fine, it just won't show up. But we need a way to populate the data. For now, we'll just use the last search term that the user typed in. And we'll go in here to, this was our first version. It's called inflexible code. OK, so we created a new view controller. And we can actually get rid of all this. All right, so the first thing is because we're inside, we're going to subclass our initial iTunes list view controller. And we're going to call it the Today view controller. And that's because we want to customize a little bit. We want to make the items a little bit smaller. So we'll go ahead and in view.did_load, customize the layout of the collection view. So we'll make them smaller. We'll also disable scrolling because we don't need that while we're in here. And we'll tell it that we want to be able to use the full expansion mode, which is widget largest available display mode. And the other reason that we want to subclass is because we need to conform to this NC widget providing. And really, it's just a couple of methods that are required, this widget perform update. And in this case, we're going to use our new API that we built in our framework. And we're just going to call search for artist. And we're going to use the last search term. We stored that somewhere from the app, and I'll show you where. And then we're just going to reload our collection view when we come back. And there's just a couple more things that we need to do. We need to tell it. We want to customize cell for row because we want to make the corner radius just a little bit smaller so it's proportional. And the last thing that we'll do is tell it how large we'd like to be. And we just want to display 4 rows of items. So I think this is OK. So we'll go ahead and run. Simulator's a little wonky with extensions. But hey, all right, it worked. And also from here, we still have the functionality that we can tap to favorite items. So that works nice. And if I were to go back, if I were to go back to the application and search for something else, I like Swift. And I'd get that. And then, Then if I went back to the Today extension, OK. So there again, it's going to make the network call, get the data back. It's doing the same thing. And it's also sharing the same database that the application is. So with very little code, we were able to build this Today extension. It's not terribly sophisticated, but we've reused it. So how are we sharing the data between them? So iOS gives you something called an app group for this sort of thing. They give you a few mechanisms for sharing data. But the app group is kind of like your sandbox in that it includes a few things. The first is a shared container. And this is just a URL, just like your documents or caches or any of the other system URLs that are provided. But it allows any application or extension that has the correct entitlements to read and write from it. So that's a perfect place for us to put our core data database. We also get from that, they're also available to you is a shared keychain. So if your application needs to authenticate users and requests, you can store tokens in there. And then also shared user defaults. So if you want to store preferences or maybe store the last search term that they used, that's a good place that both the extension and the application can read from it. It's as easy as turning on the entitlement, the capability inside of Xcode. You just give it a name and turn it on. I'll just mention the keychain's a separate entitlement. App groups are not available on the watch. So I think when watchOS 1 first came out, they were, and you could use an app group to share data, but that disappeared with watchOS 2. And so there's no concept of sharing any sort of common URL. And if you decide to enable app groups or a shared keychain or shared user defaults, then you'll need to go in and migrate your existing data over to these new stores. And so just keep that in mind. Getting the shared container is really easy. You just take the name of the app group that you created. You ask the default file manager to give me the URL for this app group, and then you can write to it and read from it. And it's the same thing with user defaults. These user defaults are just like the standard user defaults that you probably use, but again, you use your app group name, and you create a suite for it, and get back your user defaults. So really nice way to share. And what we did in the, I can show you in the code here too, I put in the manager the ability to read from our user defaults and read the last search term, which is right here. And I did the same thing in the view controller when you save. So it writes to the same user defaults. So at work, we do the same thing with our Alto app. We have our mail kit, and each one of these extensions imports it. So for instance, the notification content, which allows you to see some UI when you get a push notification and the user force presses on it. And in that case, we need to do the same things we do in the app. So if we don't have the email yet on the device, we need to go out and fetch it and bring it down and then show it to the user. We have an iMessage extension that we built for it, and it shows in the picker there all of the email attachments that you got. And again, it's the same thing. We need to sync those. We need to make sure they're up to date. And we need to use the same functionality that's in our framework. And same with the share and the today extension. I also have an app that I work on holidays and things. It's a to-do application, and it's pretty simple, but I strongly recommend, if you're really passionate about this, to create a couple of these kind of pet projects for yourself, because they're awesome. You get a chance to try out new things that you can't try out at work. I mean, they introduced a Siri intent for tasks and reminders and notes this year. You want to play with it, you want to try it. It's really nice to be able to do it and actually ship it out into production. I got a lot of experience with the CloudKit this way, but it follows the exact same format. To-do kit and runs on the watch, and share extension, and uses CloudKit to sync across devices. And it's just a lot of fun, and I might make $8 or $9 from it. All right, so let's talk about some tips here. We have really harsh environments for extensions. So what I mean, and this is what I said earlier, there are more ways that your code can run now. It's very, very aggressive when it comes to things like time, memory limits. For instance, we found that when working on the content extension, and we worked on implementing the notification service extension, the service extension is the one where the system wakes you up when a push is received before it gets shown to the user. So it allows you to go out, download additional data, mutate the notification, change the way what it's going to appear. And we found that you get about 5 megabytes of memory available before the system will kill you. So that's very, very low. And you also have very little time to do your work. So that's one. Let's see. Also, you have to consider that you're running in different cases now. You're running in the Today extension or an iMessage app. And if you're a mail app like us or somebody that requires authentication, you're going to run into cases where the user isn't authenticated anymore. Maybe you've shipped a new version of your app in the database and you need to migrate the data. And the first time that the user interacts with your app is by pulling the Today extension down. So kind of in a problem here because you need to migrate. That may take some time and use a lot of resources. And you're in a Today extension where things are really constrained. So those are just the cases that you have to consider. I mean, in our case, we won't migrate. We'll just show stale data inside of the extensions until the user opens the app and we get a chance to migrate. You also have things to keep an eye on when you're synchronizing with your models. So you keep in mind that with these extensions in your frameworks, they're running in separate processes. So when the Today extension launches and your app comes up and you've opened up a connection to your database and you're reading and writing, your app could be running simultaneously with that in another process. And the mechanisms that you had in place for maybe your UI to get an update about a change to the database isn't going to fire. I mean, they're in separate processes. I mean, I can show you, let's see. If I were to open up the app here, and I'll try to pull down, but in the simulator, it doesn't really work. Okay, if I, let's say, if I were to say star these items, then go back to my application and open it up, they're not starred. I mean, because that happened in a separate process. The other one doesn't know about it. If I were to run the app again, this time when I launch, it'll reread from the database and it'll pick up those changes. But so you have to account for that. And in iOS, they introduced some technology into core data with this last release to specifically address this sort of problem. So they have the notion of a NS persistent history. And when your application, at any time at once, it can pass a date or a token that you get from core data, and it'll tell you about all of the changes since that date. And then you can purge it. So in this case, had I enabled that, and I did, and it didn't really work right. So either I did something wrong or they haven't fully got it sorted out yet because it's still beta. But it'll give you a list of all the changes. And then you can just merge those in to your main context or update your UI with them. And apparently, I believe there are some other, Realm has something similar that they use to do this. Background tasks, when you're running in extensions, there's an asterisk there because there is no background task. I mean, the most you can do, there's no UI application, there's no UI application background task. Then the best you can do is there's a class process info, and you can say perform an expiring activity. And you give it a closure, and it'll give you some time to run. It's not very much, and it's recommended to use that for things like cleaning up your database or other things, but not a long-running task that you do in the background. Another tip is with logging. I would say avoid adding a logging framework to your framework. It's really not up to the framework to include things like logging and then spit out a whole bunch of logging to the console. I've seen this in a lot of cases. I think the better pattern is to maybe assign a delegate to your framework that's a logging delegate, and it can spit all the different log messages out there, and you can leave it up to the consuming application to decide what you want to do with it. And that way, in your app, you may include something like a Cocoa Lumberjack, and you can write it to a file, but it's completely up to you. And what I would recommend also is looking new in iOS 10, they introduced the unified logging framework. So this is a logging framework that's actually built into the system. And it's great, you don't have to bring in a dependency. And the best part about it is that you can bring up the console and get output to the console, and you can see how the logging is working from various processes. So, if I'm trying to debug the Today extension, and I also want to see what kind of output's coming from my app at the same time, it works perfectly. And it's also very helpful if you're working on background pushes and background URL sessions and those sorts of things. Just, when you need a clear view into kind of everything that's going on in the system at the same time. And you can use their framework, and it works great. And yeah, it's good for cross-process output. I'd also recommend that you kind of develop your framework to be able to start in a nano mode or a minimalist mode, or a way that, like for instance, our mail framework, when it starts, it tries to do a lot of things for the consuming app. It's related to mail. It'll go get it'll get your settings. It'll update your folder list. It'll sync new messages. It'll do all of this work for you because it's really convenient, and the caller just has to say, hey, start. But when you're starting up in these harsh environments and you don't have a lot of memory, you don't want the framework just running wild and making all of these calls for two reasons. One, it uses a lot of memory. And number two is you don't really know when it's done. And a lot of these extensions will say, hey, we want you to be up to date. Wake up, take a few seconds to update your data, and call this completion handler when you're done. You don't know if your framework's kind of running wild in the background. You don't know when it's done. So what we do is we just make an option to start it and not do anything else, and then the user can explicitly call different functions that they want to get the data they need. All right, so our product person comes back and they say, all right, we want to do iTunes Search 3.0. And you say, okay, well, what's that going to have? And they want to introduce a iMessage app. So you say, okay, well, again, this looks pretty familiar. Let me think about how I'm going to do this. So you create a new target, and it gives you an MS Messages app view controller. And this is unlike the Today extension, where it's kind of a vanilla view controller that you use. They give you a very specialized one. So in our case, we can't take our iTunes list controller and subclass it. I mean, we have to inherit from this, and we can't inherit from our list. So the approach we'll take here is we'll add it as a child view controller. We'll just embed it inside of the one they give us. That'll be super easy. We'll also override the size of the items when we start. And in this one case, just to keep things a little cleaner, we're going to have to create a delegate, because when you tap on it, right now the code is set to star it, make it a favorite. In this case, we want to tap it and just call a delegate method that calls back into the Messages app so it can do the work in the iMessage app. So you can send this artwork to a friend of yours. So let's just look at how we might implement that. And so they give us this view controller. It's the Messages content view controller. And we're going to build the protocol. Well, I'm sorry. No, they give us this Messages view controller. And inside of here, we're going to add our child view controller. We're going to assign the delegate. And when they select a track, it's actually really easy to add it. I mean, we have to write it out to a temporary directory, but then we just insert it into what's called the active conversation of the Messages controller. And that's easy. And again, just like before, we're going to adjust the item size. In this case, we decided, okay, look, we're only going to include tracks that the user has marked as favorite. So we're going to call it favorite tracks. And that's a query to core data that you could have written inside of the view controller, but it's another example of the type of stuff you want to move outside and into your framework. So we'll just ask the manager for a list of favorite tracks. We'll reload the data, and this should work. They give you all right, so I have the favorites that I've selected, and I can pick one and add it, and it adds. I mean, so that was super easy, to take advantage of these extensions. And then I think if you've built it from the beginning with the thought that you might need to run in these sorts of environments in different ways, then it'll work out nicely for you. So use frameworks to create reusable code, and let extensions try to help guide your architecture. And that's it.